We've discussed throughout the day that ground platforms are critical to the Army's modernization effort, and we know that we just don't have enough money invested in that modernization effort, given the requirement that secretaries and chiefs have to balance end strength, readiness, and modernization. So it is important that we have forums like this just to talk about it. So as General Ham said, this panel has been asked to address the topic critical enabling technologies for future movement and maneuver capabilities for the far term. AUSA has assembled an all-star cast. And I really like this panel, not only for its experience, but for its diversity. We've got a senior Army official from the Maneuver Center of Excellence. We've got a senior fellow in a think tank with long-time think tank experience. And then we've got industry, and we're bookended with one of the stalwarts in ground platforms at BAE, and then a small innovative company out of Michigan in Pratt & Miller. So I think we've got a good balanced panel that can bring a healthy discussion on future technologies. So with that in mind, let me introduce our panel, and then I'm going to let them, or ask them to make opening remarks, starting with our panel chair, Mr. Don Sando, is SES Deputy to the CG and Director of the CEDID at the Maneuver Center of Excellence, where he's responsible for developing and integrating the Maneuver Center's concepts and requirements, conducting experimentation to validate maneuver capabilities to support the Army, the Joint Force, interagency, and multinational organizations. So he's going to get about 80% of the taskers coming out of this forum today. He's accompanied by three distinguished panel members, Dr. David Johnson, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, where he focuses his work on innovation, joint operations, and strategy, and is no stranger to these kinds of discussions. After Dr. Johnson, we'll hear from Dr. Buck Tanner, who is the program manager for the Future Fighting Vehicle at BAE Systems. And then we'll round out the panel with Mr. Lynn Bishop, who's the Vice President for Engineering Services at Pratt & Miller Engineering. As I said, a small business based in Michigan, doing some innovative technologies applied to the defense sector. So with that, we're going to give them each a few minutes to make some opening comments, and we'll leave plenty of time for your thoughtful questions. So, Mr. Sando.
Thank you, sir, and thanks again to AUSA for giving us this opportunity to dialogue with industry. At Fort Benning, we try and be very open and candid with industry. We think the collaboration amongst us and academia and our allies, of course, helps us to both understand the problem sets and then identify solutions. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to speak to the Board of Army Science and Technology. I brought a stack of slides like this. I was followed by a retired general officer who had 0 slides, and he says, it's very liberating not having slides. So since I was introduced as a senior Army official, I'm very liberated today. I have no slides. It's good going last and not having slides, because many of the things that I would have put on a slide have been discussed already throughout today, but that's fine. So let me just try to put this in context a little bit, and we look forward to the discussion. You know, the question is, okay, so what are we going to do? All right, so where are we going to go in the future? We owe that to ourselves as an Army, as a maneuver force, and we owe that to you as industry. If I did have a slide, I would give you that. I would show you the strategy to get a strategy for our maneuver force modernization. So it starts with the operational environment that we talked about up front. It goes to, okay, if that's the way we envision the world, how do we want to fight and operate in that world? Let's not reacting to what the enemy's doing or reacting to what somebody else is doing. How do we, as the United States Army, as part of the Joint Force, how do we want to fight on the battlefield? All right, and that's articulated in our operating concepts, our functional concepts. So given the world, as we think we understand it moving toward, how we want to fight those concepts, and okay, what is required, what are those required capabilities to do that? And obviously combat vehicles are critical to that, because the essence of that, in my judgment, is they enable freedom of movement and freedom of maneuver to our commanders. You know, we don't have the answers at Fort Benning. We have some. I can't say we don't have all of them. But our role is to provide versatility to the force. So combat vehicles are critical to that. And there's a range of combat vehicles. One size doesn't fit all. We have the light fleet that we've talked about a lot today. We have strikers. We have Abrams and Bradleys. We have armored multi-purpose vehicles. So we have a range of capabilities, not unlike a golf bag that has 14 clubs. One of those clubs should work for any particular shot that you have. We have a range of capabilities in the Army. The problem with having a range is you have to invest in that. And General McMaster talked about sustaining, improving, developing, replacing, and assessing. The replacing and the divesting is key, right? So as we work our maneuver force modernization strategy, key to that is not what we want, all right? General Allen doesn't say, hey, here comes the guys from Fort Benning with another list of things that they want. He wants to sit up and say, okay, what don't you want? So that's key. How do you divest from what we have today and transition to what we need in the future? And that's critical. So stay tuned. This same bat channel next couple of months, and we'll be able to start informing that a little bit better, because that's key. But regardless of the direction we go on this axis of modernization, we do think there's a few critical enabling technologies, and I think it was on Colonel Knuckles' slide earlier. But a few things, given the environment and how we want to fight, which is really characterized by action and initiative and offensive operations, with smaller forces operating on a flat, fast, lethal battlefield, there's a couple things that enable that. Regardless of what the next generation of combat vehicles look like, regardless of what the next generation of body armor or small arms or anything else looks like, if those characteristics of the battlefield are how we want to fight as the United States Army, there's a couple of things that we think are central to that. There may be others, and that's why we have these dialogues. The first is vehicle protection suite. It's not just active protection system. It's not just responding to attack. It's how do I see the environment around me, and how can I defeat the enemy before they can defeat me, all right? So pre-shot detection, not just hostile. It's easy to know where the shot's coming from after it's shot. It would be nice to know where is it coming from before it's shot, all right? So where's the enemy, divine his intentions, and eliminate his ability to engage us. So the vehicle protection suite writ large, of which active protection system is critical. The reason active protection system is critical, because we talked about it earlier, is it's just a problem of physics. You can only get so big, we think we're there, before you get too big. And big, in a formation perspective or a system perspective, has limits on your ability to be fast and agile on the battlefield. So it drives up logistics burden, it drives up your combat trains, all those things that go around with a big, heavy vehicle are cumbersome and counter to how we want to fight. So vehicle protection suites, of which APS is important. Advanced armor, I think Cheese talked about that a little bit. So how do we, how can we can make some inroads in that, but we can't solve all our problems with any one thing. So vehicle protection suites with active protection systems, advanced armor solutions, composites, however you want to describe it, so how we can get around that. And that's really from a protection perspective. From a mobility perspective, power and energy. Everything that we have takes energy. All right, so how do I generate it? How do I resupply it forward without having to have tremendously long logistics tails? How can I manage that for active protection systems, for directed energy, for all these other things that we want? We have to generate power and energy, manage it at the system and formation level, and again, not have tremendously long and overburdened lines of communication. And then directed energy, so we talked about that. How do you employ directed energy? We're using it today in counter UAS. How can we use it in counter optics? We talked about that before. We think investments in that area will help again. Because big bullets with lots of gunpowder take lots of trucks carrying lots of big bullets with lots of gunpowder. So how can I reduce that logistics burden from a lethality perspective? So directed energy. So vehicle protection suites, power and energy, advanced armor, composite materials, and then directed energy. Related to all that is sensors. Right? So how can I see better, more clearly, so I can detect and identify and engage, make those decisions to our advantage. So that's in there as well. All right, and just a couple of caveats, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Johnson. So we think those are critical enabling technologies on how we want to fight. All right, so the age-old question that we always get faced with in this business is when somebody shows up with some technology or some advancements is, how does this help us do our job on the battlefield? And that's the first question that you have to ask. The second question is, does this change my role on the battlefield? All right, so if you only want to get better from the way you're doing things now, you will just be better doing the things you are now. If you want to do something differently, you have to ask that second question, and often we don't ask that. So we need that help from industry. You know, so what is this new thing? How does it help me do something different, not just do what I'm doing today better? All right, powered flight, and all the, you know, there's plenty of examples of how I just fundamentally change what I'm doing on a battlefield. Radio communications versus telephone. So we're still communicating. I'm just doing it differently, and how it enables things. So think that. And then I would be remiss if I didn't channel my inner General McMaster and caution. All right, caution. Caution us about, you know, over promises of technology. All right, so we you know, and the chief helps us in that regard, because he reminds us that we have to fight today with the Army that we have, and we have to fight tomorrow with the Army we have. And we know that because our sons and daughters are out there doing that for us today. So we have to be informed about that, and we don't want to be, you know, again, it's brutal business. It's critical that we don't lose sight of that, and we can't over promise on technology. All right, so we have to be realists. Now, there's a fine line between fishing and standing on the body of, you know, standing next to a large body of water looking like you're not doing anything. Okay, a fine line between fishing. All right, so there's a fine line between, you know, being the person that always says no, well, that's too hard, right? Directed energy, that's just too hard. You know, your power and energy, cooling problems, you just can't do it. Okay, well, see me in 10 years, right? So we have to be informed in that and you know, smart about it, to use that. But that doesn't mean we don't want to ask those questions. So not only how does it improve, you know, science and technology, how does it improve my ability to do what I'm doing today, but again, does it change fundamentally what we're asking our formations to do on a battlefield? All right, I'll stay away from Alvin and Heidi Toffler. We can discuss that, you know, if you have a question about that, war and anti-war, those kinds of thoughts. But this dialogue is important. If you have a question that you don't ask, it's your fault. But if you have one that you think of when you're on a train or plane or automobile leaving today, please, you know, reach out to us because this dialogue is important, and we certainly appreciate your continued collaboration on that. Dr. Johnson.
Well, thanks to AUSA for having what is left of me here today. As my wife affectionately calls me, her broken down old colonel. I want to begin by saying I have no idea what the deep future is going to be like or what the critical enabling technologies are going to be in the future. And I hope I have a slide. See, I don't even know what the slides are going to be. Okay. So I do think it is going to include ground combat forces, and I do think it's going to involve combined arms. But I think the challenge facing us determining a path to the far-term future is not unlike that George Marshall faced when he came in the Army in 1902, when there's not an internal combustion engine inside the Army. He joined the Philippine Constabulary, where it's completely dependent on man and animal power. He's introduced as a colonel to great industrial power warfare in World War I. And the Army starts to shift its institutional lessons from a frontier constabulary to the Army of a great power. Next slide. So in Marshall's Army Chief of Staff in 1939, on the verge of World War II, the Army had less than 190,000 soldiers in it. By 1945, it had over 8 million. Nobody in 1918 could even imagine what 1941 was going to be like. Furthermore, the technologies of war had radically changed in this period with the appearance of bombers with atomic weapons, ballistic missiles, jet fighters, and penicillin, which for the first time a wound meant you were either not going to die from infection or as a warrant for amputation. Huge change on the battlefield. So those that are contemplating the deep future out to 2050, these are the kinds of things that can happen in the course of one career. I do believe right now, though, we need to focus on the range of operations and be serious about the fact that there are going to be different kinds of adversaries we're going to confront. I personally think those are irregulars, hybrid, and state adversaries. And I think we've really missed a lot of what's been going on in the world for the last 15 years as we focused on Afghanistan and Iraq. This is not unlike after Vietnam, with folks who studied Israel in the '73 Yom Kippur War. Of all the things we hadn't been paying attention to as a state power acquired capabilities to confront us because they knew what we do. Next chart. The last one, I want to talk about how we might approach this not programmatically but intellectually. This is a graphic from the Army After Next in 1997, which is a predecessor to the Unified Quest Games. So the central idea is to go to the mountaintop in the future. Once you get there, look back and see the path that got you there. And to quote General Albert Wiedemeyer, one of the great strategists in the history of the Army, you can't start a journey if you haven't charted a destination in mind. It also helps us, quite frankly, to get rid of the good idea we have to do right now syndrome, which plagues organization and creates enormous friction. But I think what's important about this process, if you do it right, you're focused on problems, not solutions. We've had a lot of talk today about what is going to be there in 30 years. It may be. There may be something else, because what's important about this chart is there's nothing about counterinsurgency or resurgent Russia or rising China in 1997 on our plan to go to the future. So it can create narrow bounds that prevent seeing different possibilities over long term. And I think we need to think in the terms of near, mid, and far. So General Marshall was a brilliant chief of staff about the now. He mobilized an army against a problem in 1940 that required enormous mobilization. And in 5 years, we built 90,000 tanks and self-propelled artillery pieces, 198,000 combat aircraft, and by the way, 137 aircraft carriers. Unfortunately, 5 years after the war was over, we're completely unprepared for Korea or the Cold War. So this is not just a problem of the now, it's a problem of now and the future. And as we've seen in the charts about the program for the future, these are decades-long programs that if you fix a point, a stake in the ground, you will get there. And there'll be a lot around you that you didn't anticipate. So what I think you need to do is radically challenge these assumptions that are getting to your decision points before you get there. And we know that you have to stake out a course that makes sense today because we don't get to plan for 2035. We plan for tomorrow morning and moving forward. And I hate the word flexible, but that is the key to this. Be alert to what is happening in the technological environment around you because it is not static. If we'd had a 25-year plan in 1941, we would have filled the Mark I tank from World War I with maybe a radio. So I think what we need to understand is that, like Lily Tomlin once said, one of my favorite comedians, she said two things I love. One, I used to be a cynic till I found out I couldn't keep up. But the other one is that the road to the future is always under construction. And that pathway, it is like if you're at Fort Sill, the single mountain in the future is a really good idea, Blockhouse Signal Mountain. If you're in the Alps, you will know as you get to each intervening ridgeline where the future really lies. So I believe in Michael Howard's advice is that, no matter how clearly you think you're never going to get it right, the important thing is not to get it really wrong. And I think that's what I see in the plans you're doing at MCOE. So we need to really pay attention to methodology and analytics, challenge our assumptions against the future, and see the signposts that point out vulnerabilities. I mean, IEDs were not invented in Iraq and Afghanistan. We can start then just to do hedging actions that say, what if my assumption's incorrect? What do I do to make sure it doesn't induce catastrophic failure? And what I think this does is, quite frankly, what we did with the Big Five. The M1 tank looks nothing like it did when it was fielded when I was in Europe. It was a modular system that could be upgraded over time, went from 105 to 120. Whether we've reached the limit of that modernization after 20 some odd years, I don't know. But it is a good model about thinking about when I build a platform, it is not the only version. It's an F-16 Block 35 for a reason. Finally, I think the most important is the intellectual challenge. We need to educate a generation of officers and political leaders that have known nothing other than insurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan, that this is a different world now. I think this is our real challenge. When I talk to audiences, I gave a talk at the 1st Marine Division a couple weeks ago, and the 82nd before that. There's always some bright battalion commander when you lay out a scenario for a fight who says, well, have we thought about economic sanctions yet? We need to start thinking about fighting, not diplomacy, not economic sanctions. But this is an Army that's going to have to fight where it goes, and we need to pay more attention to that, I think. So I think that's the big intellectual challenge. We taught ourselves to do anything but fight at the operational and strategic levels in the last 15 years. I think we need to get back to it. And there are going to be vehicles and equipment that we need to do that and reduce risk. That's all I have. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Go ahead. Next slide.
All right, in the next chart too, please. So the Army's got quite a history for combat vehicle development programs. Not always been successful, and I guess I've been personally involved, if you go to the next chart, please, with quite a few of these so-called failures, if we could consider failure to be those that don't get into the hands of soldiers or through the fielding process. But there's some good information that can be extracted from some of that history and a lot of good lessons. One basic given is that increased capability generally means greater weight. And because of that, one combat vehicle system can't meet the full range of requirements, from rapid deployability to being pure threat capable. So you've got to have a range of systems. And rapid deployability typically means air transportable. And as has been mentioned, that means 16 tons of the max for like a C-130, and really you want multiple units onto an aircraft to give you a significant capability. So it makes it very weight constrained. The Armored Systems Modernization Program, from the 80s to the early 90s, was so focused on the pure threat, so focused on the Soviets. Ended up with two weight classes, 40 tons and 60 tons. So it had realistic kind of weight constraints. The four that were 60 tons are shown there, the Block 3 tanks, so a tank capable system. The Future Infantry Fighting Vehicle, at 60 tons. The Advanced Field Artillery System, which was Crusader, and it actually lasted the longest. And then the Ground Mobility Vehicle, or Grizzly, which a few prototypes were built. And then two systems at 40 tons, which were LOSAT, line of sight anti-tank, and then the ammunition resupply vehicle for Crusader. But in parallel to that, the Army also had these early systems, these C-130 capable systems that were being produced. The armored gun system, you've heard about the M8, that was going to be the Sheridan replacement. Future Scout cavalry vehicle, again, prototypes were built, electric drive, at least one of them, and then the composite armored vehicle. Again, all these were advanced programs which were all capable of going into C-130 and being rapidly deployable. With the end of the Soviets, with that threat gone, the Army and becoming more of a CONUS-based force, there was more focus on maybe a family of deployable systems, and that's where Army After Next came in, as you just saw on the chart. And that study considered three classes of systems: very light, less than 10 tons, medium, kind of 26 tons, and then heavy, around 40 tons. So it was, again, a recognition that there needed to be a range of systems. And then there was Future Combat Vehicle, which was kind of a study within Army After Next, looking at, that 26-ton. Actually, we really working at 20 tons. And then it all led to manned ground vehicles, are part of FCS, which you've heard about here already. Part of FCS also was three classes of unmanned ground vehicles, very small, 10 kind of pounds, medium, kind of 3 tons, the mule, and then the heavy, which was the armed robotic vehicle, around 9.5, 10 tons. So those knowledge of a range of systems there was required, and same thing on the air vehicles. On the manned ground vehicle, again, it was a family of systems built on common chassis for all the different variants. And it started off, again, focused on C-130 when it was first started at 18 tons, and then incrementally grew as as additional survivability was identified as being needed. So we went through a range. I designed common chassis at 24 tons, 27 tons, 31 tons, and was doing a 35-ton one when, you know, in 2009 we were terminated. That contract is still not closed. So next chart, please. So in general, it's always better to be lighter weight. But capability generally means you are, you know, equates to weight. But ways to reduce weight, has been mentioned several times today, and Sean Moran started it off by saying it's really internal volume. One way to reduce internal volume is to reduce the crew size. Go from 4 to 3, go from 3 to 2, or even remote the crew completely and just go to a robotic system, which allows you to remove that crew from that combat vehicle. Increased lethality, meaning overwhelming or assured lethality. It's always generally good. And assured lethality means once it's hit, if you hit it, there's no doubt that it's dead. The turret is off. And nothing beats that lethality capability than impact energy. So high velocity kinetic energy, whether that's through a missile or a gun, it's hard to defeat. And if we talk about survivability and heard a lot about EPS, you got to have a layered approach. And detection avoidance, SIGMAN had a lot of focus during ASM, as well as did hit avoidance in APS. So APS, right now we're implementing systems that are good against slow moving, so shape charge kind of capabilities or chemical energy threats. There's opportunity to expand that to the kinetic energy, to a rod, and as also was mentioned again today and this morning, was the need for the hemispherical APS system and the pre-shot. Don't wait to be shot at. Defeat the threat before it can shoot you or shoot at you. But if you can put enough energy on the target, then even an APS system can't beat you. And that's why that high velocity kinetic energy, whether that's 140 that was like looked at during ASM, the 130 that the Germans are looking at now, or like a 137 Raven gun that Arctic is looking at now. So a couple things that ASM had right, I think, is that range of capabilities, recognition that, you couldn't have one system do everything, but they had 40 and 60 ton, as well as in parallel to that, they had the C-130 capable systems as in Future Scout Cav system, as well as AGS. But they also had a PM, an 06 PM survivability systems, just focused on survivability, with sub-PMs for NBC, armor, signature management, as well as APS. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Bishop, can we have the first slide from the next deck, please?
Great. Well, thank you, AUSA, for putting this on. Again, it's great to be in such company of great, thought leaders, especially coming from a small business out of, just outside of Detroit in Michigan. So thanks for having us. You might be wondering, again, why a company that's sort of rooted in racing and motorsports is here. The challenges that we face in racing are very similar. We make the analogies a lot to kind of fighting the fight in the war, and that, we're against, 30, 40 of our, most determined competitors to reach a finish line as well before we are. Racing is risky. We do it in the pursuit of competition, but it is risky. We're asking our drivers to climb into these things, and sometimes there are accidents, and sometimes our friends, have lost their lives again in the pursuit of competition. So safety is very important to us. It's not only about speed. In fact, our number one trade for every race car that we design and build is safety. Doing what we can to help our drivers, fight their fight and reach the finish line first. Maybe if you go to the next slide, that'll help the audience maybe see the portfolio of the different race programs that we do. It's anywhere from sports car racing to helping our customer teams in IndyCar and NASCAR compete. Just a little historical background. You see a lot of Chevy representation there. Pratt & Miller is exclusive to GM Racing in motorsports, so they locked us up in 2005 to be exclusive to them. Didn't want us working for Toyota and Ford, and it's been a great relationship. So that's why you see the heavy Chevy and GM representation there. But in addition to the safety aspects, we're constantly focused on lightweighting, the mobility, the power and performance of the vehicles. So that's a constant development cycle for us across all the portfolio of vehicles that we're involved in racing. I appreciate some of the comments here about not trying to, develop a 100% solution. In fact, we know going into a season that we're only going to develop an 80% solution because we don't know what the competition's doing. We don't know what the sanctioning bodies, what they're going to do for rules changes race to race. So we continuously have to be tracking what is our competition doing, what are the rules going to face at us the next race, so that we can get some new developments into the car and respond to, what the new threat is for us, which is a rule change or a competitor coming in with a new technology. So we've been very fortunate to take a lot of what we've learned in racing and extend that to other industries. And we are an R&D company, so we get the fun job of and the beneficiaries of what you folks work so hard to do, which is to figure out strategy and requirements and doctrine, and we get to play. We essentially are the skunk works that get to help inform our customers, what the art and the physics of the possible is. So thank you for the opportunity to do that. It's a lot of fun. The examples that you see up here on the screen are all things that we've done just in the past 10 years in automotive, defense, robotics, and then certainly motorsports. You can see the how fortunate we are to get to do the things we do. And as it relates to defense, I think one of the unique positions that we're in is that because we're involved in so many different industries, we are at the intersection of a lot of innovation and a lot of technology, and we do a lot of knowledge transfer and innovation transfer between the commercial sectors that we work in. In automotive, for example, for years we've been helping our customers with improving the performance of their cars, with reducing weight. So introducing composites, working on active chassis and control systems. Recently, the past 4 or 5 years, most of our work in automotive has been around autonomy and driver assist systems. And just the past 2 years, the explosion and the amount of investment that has gone into the automotive sector just in self-driving and autonomous systems is crazy. I wish that the DoD had the luxury of having, a portion of the budget that that industry is spending right now. There's a lot of innovation going on, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what I hope that we may be able to contribute to the discussion is, what are some of the other technologies that are direct complements to what we're trying to do in ground vehicle development, and futuring what technologies can help support the efficacy and the future fighting force. And what are some of the things that we see being exposed in motorsports technology, automotive technology, some of the other areas that we see could benefit ground vehicle systems? I think, number one, there's nothing new here that we haven't already seen, but just in terms of what we have seen and some of the things that we're already working on in the RDT&E space for defense, specifically with DARPA and some of our other customers, is number one, materials. We heard Dr. Cheeseman talk a lot about what's going on at ARL and different material science. We've had the benefit of working with him on some pretty unique platforms in that area. And it's not only just the raw material science, but it's how can you work with mixed materials? How can you work with a structure of materials, dissimilar materials, and join them together to create a structure that meets or optimizes the need? It's also the manufacturing of those materials. So we talked a lot about additive manufacturing, rapid prototyping. On our race cars right now, we deploy a lot of RP parts, from the direct plastic, the direct metal manufacturing that's going, technology advances that are happening right now. We do it because we're building maybe 10 one-offs of very complex shapes and structures, and it's easy for us to just print those off instead of building tooling and machining those. So the technology's there, and the pace of innovation in technology is very impressive. The next area is autonomy and AI. Every system in automotive right now is being planned for driver assist or optionally manned. By-wire systems and control systems on cars are pretty much complete. Pretty much every car out there, certainly premium vehicle, is by-wire enabled and has the ability to drive without a human in the loop. And then, there's obviously the software development on top of that. And on the back end of autonomy, where probably the biggest investment is going on right now is in the AI. That, how can you decision making with those autonomous systems? And there's just a lot of investment going on. And I think, we see an opportunity for the DoD to insert some of those technologies, some of the standards that are now just being developed for the automotive industry. There's a lot of opportunity to leverage some of the work that's gone on there, especially with the restricted S&T and RD&T budgets that we're facing. The other area is energy and power. A lot of focus on electric vehicles, certainly in automotive, and how to augment those electric vehicles with fuel cell technologies. We just unveiled, or GM and Antarctic just unveiled the ZH2, which is a fuel cell concept vehicle at AUSA recently. So we were very fortunate to be involved in that, and there's a lot of other fuel cell technology going on in the commercial space as well. And then finally, I think on the lethality side, a lot of discussion over directed energy, laser systems. We're very fortunate to work with our customers right now. One is Northrop Grumman, who has recently shown the capability to have a 30 kilowatt directed energy system on for counter UAS and other applications on a light tactical vehicle. So again, we're here to try and help inform the community, help inform our customers about what the art and the physics of the possible are. And we like to show that through technology demonstrators, through physical prototypes, through physical technology demonstrations of where is the state of the art, what other technology gaps to help inform, where the investments need to be to make this technology feasible. So, and I will close with that. We're a 300-person company. Yeah, so we've got 2 locations up, but the majority of our business is, motorsports, defense, and automotive. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. Good range of experience and breadth here. So first question really is going to allow any one of the panel members to use your creative juices here. And it comes in saying, today, if you could build a new infantry fighting vehicle optimized for current operations with only TRL-6 plus technology, what would it look like? And how much better would it be than the Bradley? I think the CG wrote that one. No. Any takers on that?
Well, I would say we did that, and it was GCV. So that's what it would look like.
That's why I thought it was a V8.
I'll tell you something, Dick. So I think the real challenge here is what do you want it to do? And we've always been driven to this thing of the squad's the smallest size formation can do fire and maneuver. Well, the fire team's the smallest can do fire or maneuver. And if you start thinking about putting 5 people in a vehicle instead of 9 or 11 or 4, whatever it is, I saw the new Marine replacement, the AAV-7, that this room's not big enough for it because it's going to carry 14 Marines, a gunner, a driver, and a commander. And it's a huge target. So the question is, do we have to not just think about the material problems, but about the organizational questions? And when we raised this a number of years ago in a study, someone said, well, then a platoon leader would have 8 vehicles. Well, if you think a platoon's 4 squads, if you think it's 2 squads of 4 vehicles and there's 5 guys, so thinking about not just the technology, but the way to get smaller is to put less things inside of it. We have a 95% standard for humans inside of vehicles. So GCV had to essentially hold 16 Ray Odiernos. So it's going to be big. So I think just challenge, what you want to accomplish with these vehicles and what you can do organizationally. I'll go back to the T-14 Armada. Everybody talks about the remote turret and all this. What's important about the T-14, it has a two-man crew. In a country with declining demographics that has got to figure out how to field a force with a lot less people. Does that sound familiar?
Okay, next question was targeted or directed towards Mr. Bishop. As you build racing vehicles to 80% so that you can adapt once you see what you're going to get from your competitors, what design characteristics or processes allow you to be adaptive?
I think probably the biggest thing that we do is we build in modularity into our vehicles. There's a lot of reasons to do that from a repairability standpoint, but we know that we're going to go through a 40% bomb change from the beginning of the season to the end of the season. We don't know where that's going to be. Additionally, building in that modularity not only allows us to grow, say, certain systems or components of the vehicle in terms of technology, it allows us to leverage that across multiple platforms. So even though the race cars that you saw up there look very different, there's a lot of systems and components that are common to those. So that we, can leverage the durability, the analysis, the manufacturing, the tooling and investment that goes into those. So to directly answer your question, we are big on modularity of systems across our motorsports platforms, across our defense vehicles, across our robotics platforms. That's why in the last slide, we have this concept of an ecosystem of building blocks when it comes to our vehicle sets. And maybe to back up to the last question, if you were to ask us, and we found the MPF discussion, very interesting from a technologist standpoint in that, given the challenge, it was almost, could you build in an LVAD and a RoRo version, building in modularity with, modular packages for, lethality, for survivability, for mobility systems into it. So that is, the challenge that we often give our teams is, how can we build in modularity to these for requirements growth, for competitive growth, technology growth?
Thank you. We've had a lot of discussion today about the trades among transportability, survivability, and lethality. We always seek some combination of that. In recent years, we've tended to weight towards protection. So I'll ask the panel, start with Mr. Sando, and then anybody else wants to jump in. What is it that we need to do? First of all, would you prioritize our future look towards lethality? And if so, what technologies can help us improve lethality?
Thanks. I think I would argue that over the last 12 or 15 years, we have weighted protection in our force modernization for all the right reasons. Our investment in MRAPs and MATVs, our investment in Bradley and tank urban survivability kits, et cetera, for the fight that we had. I would also argue that over the history of warfare, lethality is what forces changes on the battlefield. All right, so a response to a change in lethality is what drives things. Our response to the IEDs, although mines and IED wasn't a new problem, but our response to that lethality was to go towards survivability. But lethality is what forced that change in us. So as we look to the future, we want to force change on the battlefield, and we need to force it through lethality. And we have done some things. We have the enhanced performance round for 5.56. We're developing it for 7.62 now. Tremendous capability developed by ARL and RDEC with great improved capability. We've got improved rounds for our large caliber with the advanced kinetic energy round and the AMP round. So we are working toward improvements in lethality, and I think we need to do that because, again, that's what's going to drive change on a tactical battlefield. We talked about directed energy and energetics, right? So we need to continue to look at that. What else can I get out of gunpowder? I mean, the Chinese did us a favor a few years ago when they developed it. Well, what can we do with it now? And how do we leverage that in advancements in both the warhead or the weapon, the bullet end and the charge end for energetics and then directed energy? But I think our recent history has been weighted toward protection. I think we need to balance that. You know, from a system perspective, from a formation perspective, we always want an appropriate combination of mobility, protection, and lethality. Again, it goes for what, all right? The question is, what do you want it to do? Well, everything, all right? Well, then it goes back to, okay, I got 14 clubs, I got a range of capabilities. So you have to balance that. So as we're looking at the light fleet, we look at what are the mission variables under which the infantry brigade combat team is most likely to be employed against. Not most dangerous, most likely. And that's why we have that range of capabilities, so the combatant commander can have a versatile mix of forces that he can apply to the problem that he sees on a battlefield. But I do think as we sit back and look at our investments in science and technology in the areas of mobility and protection and lethality, we probably need to ratchet up a little bit on lethality.
Anybody else?
I would just say that that was consistent with studies that we did back on future combat vehicle prior to, you know, FCS, was where we looked at, you know, if you had $1 a pound to spend on either lethality or survivability, which gave you the better impact. And working with AMSA, it was results were clear that adding that to lethality gave you a more effective system than adding it to survivability.
So I think what the Israelis learned in 2006 in Lebanon is really important in this discussion. So the problem they faced was not the close fight, it was getting into the close fight. So how do you take away an adversary's ability to impede your maneuver within 5 to 6 kilometers? And so the vehicle, the mobility of the vehicle is probably its greatest protection in a kind of a Russian scenario. I'd also say to look at what our adversaries, and the chief I think is absolutely on, Russia is the pacing item. We know what they're going to do till 2025. We know what the capabilities they have are. And we shouldn't have a strategy that matches them tit for tat. We should figure out how to take away something that's really critical to them. Because once we get in the close fight, I mean, there's never been an army in the history of the world, except maybe the Romans early, that could do better in the close fight. Once the Israelis got into the close fight in Lebanon, they could handle it. But it's getting into that through that anti-tank guided missiles, standoff, rocket fire, that is the central problem to close combat right now. And we don't have a solution for long-range rockets, for advanced ATGMs, and other systems that are out there that we know are out there. And I think you have to look at this problem from the totality of the problem, not just the ground combat vehicle problem.
The only other thing to add is you got to avoid that cheap kill. You got to have enough survivability to not be easily killed or cheaply killed.
So that was a great lead-in, because the last question that we have is related to mobility. And given the need to have increased mobility, thinking about what technologies are out there and what implications they have for mobility in the future, any thoughts on what is it that mobility will look like in the future? What are the mobility requirements? What will mobility of our systems look like? And then I'd ask Mr. Bishop particularly, is there anything that you've learned in the commercial sector that might help inform a discussion on mobility for the future of our combat systems?
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, we're currently involved in, you know, DARPA has set out a stretch goal. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the DARPA GXVT program. You know, so they're looking at leap ahead technologies and what mobility can look like in terms of, you know, what is the spectrum of a mission profile that a single vehicle could accommodate. You know, so we're looking at obviously high levels of active systems and the automation of those systems to include feed forward and look ahead terrain management so that the vehicle can understand what to do prior to getting to a terrain feature. And there's a lot of AI built into that. You know, obviously with, you know, trying to enable high mobility, you need weight reduction. We've talked a lot about weight. If you want to move a mass, you know, it's a lot easier to do that at a reduced mass level for required energy input. So some of the things that we're working on are, you know, what can we do to significantly reduce mass of vehicles and systems, and then what can we do to add significant speed and mobility over terrain through some of these active systems, reduced weight, and robotic and machine control.
So I want to talk about strategic mobility, not tactical mobility. And what's an undergirding assumption that I've heard for the last 20 years that the Air Force is never going to build another transport aircraft. And given the Army's ability to argue about the political dilemma that creates for decision makers, because like we heard earlier, a lot of cities are on the littorals, but a lot of them aren't. MV-22 is not going to deliver a squad of 10 Marines and solve these problems. So how do you get to the discussion about why your video, which I think is brilliant, how do you get past the Kaesong Heights to nuclear reactors? How do you get to a large-scale NEO in Nigeria? How do you do all these things that are not at the high end, but are going to happen a lot? And how do you create the demand with new operational capabilities to change the political discussion about what the Army needs to buy to meet the nation's requirements? And drive the, okay, C-130 won't carry enough? If it's politically important enough, why aren't we building something different?
Okay, any other questions from the field, from the floor? Yes, sir.
I don't quite get it. I mean, we just discovered that we have a power projection strategy. We bring everything back to the continent of the United States and then stop building ships and C-17.
I agree.
Tell me how that fits.
Well, I think it fits by the fact there's not been a demand in the last 15 years for any of that. The demand has been force protection in the combat theaters, and we've just taken right out the ball like we did in the 70s.
I think the Army just made a case for the C-17 and all of a sudden it shut down.
I agree.
We flew the wings off the C-17s we built. I don't get it.
Sir, I don't get it either. I mean, you're absolutely correct. In fact, we just had a session with the chief this morning, and one of the things that he said was, you know, we are going to be a CONUS-based power projection Army. All right, so in that regard, we're very dependent on the Navy and the United States Air Force, et cetera. Correct. So if you look at the Army operating concept and our, you know, evolving functional concept for movement and maneuver, the whole notion of expeditionary maneuver. So wherever we need to go, we know we're not there. All right. So we're either CONUS and we have to go, or we're one side of the theater, we go to the other side. So the notion of being able to deploy quickly with sufficient combat power to rapidly transition to offensive operations with enough capacity to sustain those operations and achieve a sustainable outcome, that's the essence of it all. And that's not a uniquely Army problem, that's a U.S. problem. And how we can help General Perkins and the Chief make that argument to the Joint Force is important. And so we certainly try and do that, but it is a problem. You talk about the sizing construct of the C-130 versus the C-17. You know, just at beer math, there's roughly 5 times as many C-130s as there are C-17s available to us. C-130s are theater aircraft, they're not strategic aircraft. So the likelihood to be able to use the C-130 is much greater. The problem is the legs are shorter, the capacity is shorter. So if you roll that in, you know, you go to, there's other aircraft makers and other air forces that have aircraft that are more capable than C-130 from a capacity and a range perspective. But how do you make that argument at the national level is something that needs to be made. Sir? Right, and so the whole argument of deployability, right, and being able to respond quickly and give, you know, the National Command Authority the decision space on when do I go and when do I not go, and then when I make that decision, how long does it take? Do I have 9 months to build up, you know, an armored corps, or do I have 9 hours or 9 days? So at some point you have to say, hey, I got a great plan, but I don't have the force to execute it. So it goes to the decision point. So when do I have to, if I'm going to change something and there's a part to that that's critical to that change that's not available, and okay, what's plan B?
Sir, I'm not convinced the concept of change, but I understand the chief is an opportunity to assess risk every year. And that risk assessment is a function not only of his own force, but being able to get it.
No, I agree. It's the chicken and the egg. But if there's no more money coming, then we can say, the risk is going to get higher. And we've said, every chief has said the risk increases or whatever. But the term risk almost becomes a meaningless term because we use it so often, we don't quantify it.
I guess I'm just cautioning changing the concept. This budget is not, I'd rather go with the gap than change the concept.
Well, what I'm using is that as a springboard to prove to the Hill or whatever else
Right.
that says, this is what we want to do, and you brought us all home, but now we can't get there, so we really don't have an executable.
And we don't have the political power to put our stuff back into Europe if the Russians are. Apparently, we're at the limits of what we can put in.
Right.
For geopolitics. I don't know what the inside build is on it, but how much pre-position stuff we can have. So we get away with it.
And I would say I'd say part of the discussion also is convincing those that you need to be able to deploy ground formations. That's part of the challenge. We talked about that at the beginning of the morning, is how well have we articulated that need, or how well do people believe that? And there are challenges to that politically, in the building and elsewhere, and until they're convinced that they need to deploy ground forces, they're not going to feel the impetus to have to field the systems that allow you to do that.
They want the ground forces in Texas.
The other thing I would add is, I think this discussion also, and this is not about technology for movement and maneuver, but it also speaks to the relationship that we have with our coalition partners and allies, and the need to engage them for some of the support that you talked about at the beginning, because we're not going to be fully self-sustainable when we deploy, given the shortage. I think there was a comment or a question back here. Yes, sir.
Two things, and it's such an interesting conversation right now, but a lot of times as we think about the technologies of the future, sometimes we're thinking about modernization, thinking about technologies to get out of maybe a posture problem. And in a lot of ways, when we talk about Europe right now, it may be partially a posture problem and partially a technology problem. Sometimes trying to build technologies to fix a posture problem is always not the right way to do it.
Probably mostly a posture problem as opposed to partly. Anybody else? Okay, we're going to be able to give some time back. What I'd like to do is I'm going to start with Mr. Bishop and work our way this way, give the panel an opportunity for just a couple of minutes of closing thoughts, and then we'll turn it back over to you, sir.
Great, thank you. I think just in closing, again, I think this comment was made earlier. I think for us, it's, we've failed a lot, trying to develop these tech demonstrators and technologies, but I would say that we've learned a lot more from those failures and come out of the backside even stronger. I think some of the comments over, definitely road mapping out, the strategic and into the tactical deployments of technology. But we've seen, a lot of success over, quick turns of demonstrators, of concepts of innovations, and inevitably we learn more at the back end of those, more from the failures of what didn't work. And then I think, finally when we talk about the limited budgets, what we have seen recently, and one example is Tardik just recently set up the DATSI consortium, which is the Defense Automotive Technology Consortium, where they're actively reaching out to the automotive industry, and we've been involved in a couple of those projects. So, we're hopeful that that model can be used throughout other areas to help augment and supplement, number one, the budgets, the IRAD spending that's going on not only in the defense industry, but automotive industry. And then I think for us as well, what often frustrates us as a small business is the valley of death. We see a lot of good innovation and technology that is developed out of this. There's been a lot of investment that's gone into a lot of these initiatives, and they fall into the ditch. And how do we, cross that? How do we make sure that the technology, that the lessons learned, that the knowledge base isn't lost, that it is continued? And I guess I would, appreciate any feedback or thoughts from the audience on that.
Thanks. Dr. Tanner.
I'd just say that the Army's got a lot of relevant information now about combat vehicle weights and capabilities. So from manned ground vehicle, where we looked at 20 to 30 tons, GCV, which was high 60s to 70 tons, and FFV, where we looked at 32 to 55 tons. There's a lot of data now available in the Army's hands to make a good judgment of what weight, what capability do you want, and therefore what's the resultant weight. There shouldn't be any surprises now as to what that mix is or what it can be.
So I guess the thing I'd say is that a flat budget is an assumption that is true until it's not. It is a variable that's changed when things have changed in this country. George Marshall, like I said, had 190,000 people in the Army, and 5 years later he had 8 million. A third of the GDP was going to this. So things change based on policy issues. And I think we need to expand I hear all the time in the bill, we just can't afford that. We're never going to be able to afford that. You can't right now. What's your plan B when something opens up? And how do you change what you think of as operational problems into policy problems? Because without ground forces, you can't solve these problems.
Thanks. Mr. Sando.
Hey, sir, thanks. General Ham, General Swan, General Formica, thanks for giving us this opportunity. And General Sullivan, sir, thanks for your service to our nation over these many years. You are certainly a national treasure. So speaking of national treasures, all right, so these are interesting discussions. They're very important. But I would just ask us all to remember it's our sons and daughters who continue to come to the colors of our country in a time of war and a time of uncertainty that it's all about. So if you haven't been to Fort Benning lately, you need to come down there. If you feel bad about what you're doing, you feel unloved, come down there and see one of the graduations at the National Infantry Museum or Brave Rifles Field or Todd Field or wherever, Eubanks, you name it. We train about 65 to 70,000 soldiers a year through Fort Benning. So every time I feel bad, I'm getting emails from the boss and can't get anything done, I go down to graduation. You go, okay, this is what it's about. You see our kids, you see their families, and you see what's good about our country. So I'm honored to have an opportunity to contribute in a small way to that and our team at Fort Benning. But this collaboration with you and the teams that you represent is certainly important. Our door is always open, so come on down and visit. Sir, thanks.
Well, sure couldn't have said it any better than that. It's all about the soldier. I'd like to express my thanks to the panel for your preparation and your thoughtful comments. And thanks to AUSA for hosting us and to each of you for being here and for sticking it out. Thanks.